Hello. I hope you're doing well, and I hope that you are enjoying the class. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss mutual aid and mutual care in decolonization. So I'll share my screen now. Um, Throughout the class, we talk about certain concepts like epistemic violence. So epistemic violence is a term that Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak discusses, which talks about the ways that colonialism ruined other systems of thought and knowledge. And epistemic violence looks at the ways that colonialism discredited other ways of knowing, including indigenous systems of knowledge, uh, religious and philosophical texts that existed before colonial rule. It is interesting to think about epistemic violence in relation to universals such as modern medicine and modern healthcare. In our time period, middle-class consumerism and middle-class media is filled with this rhetoric of health. Health is something we can all share. In a different time period, before a lot of feminist litigation and positivity movements, beauty was something that we could all share. And then many people who were part of the feminist movements politicized the ways that universalist ideas of beauty prioritized or celebrated white European middle class beauty ideals and often encouraged eating disorders, binge consumerism, and the ruining of the natural body. So health in many ways could be termed this same, or it could be thought of as a set of performatives that we enact under the sign of health in the English language. So in previous lectures, I've discussed Judith Butler's work regarding performativity. For Butler, gender is not innate or pre-given. It is performative in nature. So gender is not something that we are born with. We are not simply born as a man or a woman, a boy or a girl. When the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy, what Butler argues is that uh, this kind of linguistic gesture, this calling into being, this naming, is supported by a whole history. Um, the body carries an incorporated history of gender roles in the English language. Obviously, over time, because of transgender rights legislation, because of the feminist movement, and just because of changes, I guess, in norms, it might not be so important for children to be gendered or for people to overemphasize the importance of gender. So, this is perhaps because of accelerated capitalism. We work online now, and so uh, the ways that the marking of the body would have impacted our capacity to compete in the modern capitalist world has changed. It's the month of uh, 2S LGBTQ plus pride. And so obviously gender has changed considerably because of the passage of comprehensive transgender and queer rights legislation throughout the world. And so the idea that this innateness and this kind of gender binary is important has changed. And so for Butler, this kind of performance under a sign can obviously change over time. The problem is that there are a whole series of social actors, institutions, criminals, authority figures, and um, people who refuse to accept the existence of transgender and queer rights and lives, who will constantly try to uh, discipline and police one's performatives under a fixed gendered sign. So the question I would ask is whether health is performative in nature. And if so, how is it performative? Who declares someone to be healthy or unhealthy? And how are they declared to be healthy or unhealthy? So, in a certain time period, I suppose people would have thought maybe that um, certain behaviors would be unhealthy. So, if one purchased food outside of their home and did not cook all of their own food, perhaps they couldn't trust that their food would be the best food. Even eating all of one's meals at a table would have been thought to be kind of normative healthy behavior. And this was also perhaps supported by structures of marriage and reproductive labor. Obviously, someone would not necessarily think that a person could not fulfill um, kind of common sense ideas of health while also working for a living and commuting every day. So the question becomes, how is health performative and who is in a position to really uphold this language of health? Much like gender performativity, the problem with health is that could the language of health, much like the language of gender, be used against those who are thought to perform in improper ways? So if someone looks a certain way, and are they not properly gendered in their appearance? If someone does not have a body beautiful ideal or does not approximate a certain national or cultural or religious ideal, are they then going to be deemed unhealthy in a way that someone might be deemed to be an improper woman or an unattractive woman? And these questions, I think, are really important because of the ways that medicine has somehow, in many ways, taken on a sort of uh, heralded role in Western society. And medicine is also something that is kind of quintessentially middle class. And Canada has a comprehensive healthcare system. There is an ongoing class action lawsuit against the Canadian healthcare system for cases of sterilization of Indigenous women who have been forcibly sterilized by Canadian doctors and nurses who are settlers. And I guess health, again, is performative. So if you were to think about health in the same way that Judith Butler thinks about gender performativity as a way of enacting a whole set of norms over a life course that give the illusion of naturalness and the illusion of a life where there were could be no other choices to be a woman or a man. Like this, the way that performativity often works is that one is told from birth that you must enact these performatives. But what Butler points out, obviously, is that transgender and non-binary identity does exist as a viable option in life and as a political option. So then we think about this health. We can think about this health. How does someone determine whether someone is healthy? And does health become a whole set of performatives that give the illusion of a natural body? And a natural body that has actually been worked upon and medicated and sold things to and capitalized on by a capitalist enterprise like Health Canada. Is this wrong? The point is that if it is the only option, and if it is the only option to be healthy, then when one is unhealthy, what happens? So if you are an abject gendered body, you can experience criminalization, policing, transphobia, discrimination. And this is against Canadian law. Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. So we have comprehensive rights protecting transgender and non-binary people throughout Canada. So if you are deemed to be, say, unhealthy, can you be discriminated against? Obviously not. And Canada also has comprehensive laws protecting people with disabilities, the sick. But it is still this question that I have about the performatives of health. So calling oneself healthy, when I call myself healthy, am I constructing an image in my mind of someone who is unhealthy? And who is the unhealthy person? Are they someone who is not the same size as me? Or are they someone who has less financial capital than me? Are they someone who is younger or older than me? Um, are there some are they someone who I have deemed to be a person who is somehow lesser than me? And if I am doing this, then does my performative of health veer towards fascism? So I will share my screen and talk about mutual aid and mutual care movements. So this is a video of Dean Spade discussing mutual aid. Sorry, my screen is paused for some reason. I'll try again to share it. The reason that I think it is important to think about Judith Butler's work regarding gender performativity and in relation to health and the language of health and the kind of modern discourse or contemporary discourse of health, which has been prevalent in media and I think is used to mask a lot of class antagonism or even racial injustice, is because of histories of fascism. Judith Butler writes after the Holocaust, and Judith Butler's work looks at the ways that fascism has always tried to organize societies against various minorities populations and health and medicine, while seemingly neutral or good or signs of a progressive society, can also be used as tools by fascists. So this is a clip of Dean Spade discussing mutual aid.
Hello and welcome to the Your Parenting Mojo podcast. Today we're going to close what has seemed to me to be a loose end for a very long time. It's almost like an uncomfortably hanging chad for those of you who are of a certain age who remember the 2000 Bush v. Gore election here in the US. So 2 years ago now, we talked to Dr. John Powell on the topic of how to stop othering and instead build beyond belonging. And that was about the ways that we create separation between us. And at the very, very end of that interview, I squeezed in a question about volunteering, which seemed to me to promote othering because it encourages the person who's volunteering to see themselves as a person with resources and the recipient as a person who needs help and who perhaps doesn't have anything useful to contribute to the relationship or more broadly. And so I came out of that interview feeling that volunteering wasn't really the answer to all of our problems, but not having any idea of what to do instead. And so fast forward 2 years, and I actually can't remember how I discovered it, but at some point I heard the concept of mutual aid. And when I looked it up online, I found the book called Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, which is an incredibly short, bold, readable book by our guest today, Professor Dean Spade. And so Dean holds a JD and is professor at Seattle University School of Law and has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He's also the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics and the Limits of Law, as well as numerous videos, book chapters, and articles. Welcome, Dean. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
And so I guess diving into this, I guess it's kind of a mark of my privilege, I think, as a white middle class person, somewhere north of the age of 40. And I'm just now discovering what mutual aid is for the first time. And so for those who are listening, watching this, who are in a similar boat to me, can you please help us by understanding what is mutual aid, firstly, and then how is it different from volunteering and charity?
Yeah. So the basic way that I define mutual aid is that it's the part, and we think about all the work that social movements do, like all the kinds of tactics we use. We have street protests and we block oil pipelines and we, have lawsuits. All these different tactics. It's the part of social movement work where we provide for each other's direct survival needs. And it's only mutual aid if we do that based in a shared understanding that it's the systems that have created the crisis that people are in, rather than that the people are blameworthy for being in crisis. And the third element is that mutual aid always comes with an invitation to collective action. So if we're doing a mutual aid project and we're providing food and bottles of water and tents to people living in an encampment of unhoused people in our city, we're saying oh yeah, here, grab a tent, here, charge your phone. And also would you like to get involved in the group? Would you like to, be part of this group? Would you like to come to this protest we're doing about housing policy? Would you like to be part of this protest we're doing at this landlord's house? Do you want to be part of our housing justice movement? And so you don't have to get this tent or this bottle of water, but it invites people who are experiencing the crisis to join the collective action against the crisis. And so it's the reasons that that's different from charity are several. Charity/social services, that's another term we might use for that. That whole model is really originates in kind of a European model from a period of when the really significant changes were happening in terms of the economy of clearing land so that people could so that wealthy people could graze tons and tons of sheep and use the new looms that were being invented to make textiles. That whole period of kind of the shifting from mostly subsistence agriculture to different kinds of industry was a period where tons and tons of people were displaced from their land, and there became roving bands of poor people who had nothing at all, had lost the thousands of years of way of living. And those people were storming the towns and being hey, rich people, no way. And so in order to stabilize that situation where rich people could dominate those poor people and kind of keep them in line, they created a charity system that included stuff you had to go live in the workhouse and be worked to death, and included alms to the poor type idea, where rich people give some amount of money to poor people in order to get into heaven. And all of that always comes with a lot of strings attached. We only give it to the good poor people, not the bad ones, not the people who we see as morally loose. We just give it to the mothers with children whose husband died in the war, whatever it is, right? So charity still has that model today. It's a model that Is about stabilizing a system that keeps certain people rich and other people poor. It's a model that always has strings attached and a lot of like moral blame. Like, oh yeah, like you get on the wait list to maybe get housing if you can prove you're sober, if you take the psych meds we think you should take, you need to have children or not have children, you need to be a certain kind of person. It's often tied to like ideas we have about who's moral and immoral. And there's a fundamental idea in charity that if you're poor or homeless or whatever, there's something wrong with you. Like you need to get sober. You need to take this budgeting class. You need to take this parenting class. It's like the charity system or social services system kind of like really controls and judges and sorts poor people, which in the US specifically, especially like people of color, especially Black people have been targets, Indigenous people, migrants. So the charity system blames poor people. Mutual aid blames the system. These are like, they're like basically like diametrically opposed ways of thinking about like providing people's direct needs. Mutual aid work is about building huge resistance movements that could stop the conditions that make anybody have to be in crisis. Charity is about like kind of putting a band-aid on the existing crisis. And most people don't get what they need out of it, right? Like people are still like homeless in huge numbers. It's very minimal. It's like the least rich people can kick down or the government can kick down. It's crumbs that have like strings attached that it's very stigmatizing. Like it's humiliating the ways that people are forced to go through. Like, homeless shelters, for example, really are a lot like jails, like you have no privacy. You're being looked at. Just there's needless humiliation like built throughout the entire thing. People who've sought public benefits will know the same thing. Like this kind of like you have to turn your whole life over to these people. They're seeing whether or not you're good enough. They're looking for mistakes. This kind of thing. So charity and mutual aid are really, really different. And I think in the U.S., most people haven't until 2020 haven't really heard of mutual aid. Partly, and charity is like this, the idea of volunteering that you referenced in your intro is usually a reference to charity. It's like, oh, on Thanksgiving I'm going to go to the soup kitchen. It's like kind of like once a year or once every season or whatever, I plug into this thing. It's not really about the root causes of the problem. It's about like a kind of moral gesture in which I give a little something to the poor or the disadvantaged or whatever. And like you said, that feeling you had about it, like, oh, this seems like it's got a bad power dynamic. Like this seems like, look at me, I've got resources and I'm taking one of my luxury days off this week to help like it's got this kind of vibe that feels very, there's a Victorian or these even earlier European origins I'm talking about. And mutual aid is something different. It's like we're in the struggle together. We are trying to build mutual aid projects where people who are directly in crisis right now are part of doing them and governing them instead of like upper class people coming and giving something to poor people. So that's really different. I just want to say one other thing about this, which is mutual aid is also like written out of the history of social movements. So when we think about how we learn about social change, like, you learn about the history of the civil rights movement is like probably the most famous sort of social movement in the US, or the farm workers movement or whatever. When you learn about social movements, we often learn about like speeches that were given by men or laws that were passed or big cases that happened. Like that's kind of the vibe. And what's written out of that is that social movements aren't made of those moments. Those are movements that are usually happening towards the end, especially if it's like a law was passed or a court case. Like those are like the concessions that happen after huge organizing by large numbers of people who are actually the people in crisis. And that organizing is usually mutual aid. The on-ramp that most people take to get into social movement work is mutual aid. It's either I didn't have something I needed, and these people were giving it out. And when I got there, they were like, we don't think this is your fault. You shouldn't be ashamed. You want to join us? You want to fight? And that's or people getting because they're like, I was so mad this was happening to others, like maybe because it used to happen to me or because it happened to someone I loved or I saw it on the news. And I like want the first thing people want is like, I want to be part of helping others. I'm so mad this is happening. Like that is this beautiful instinct that people have. I want to help. And so mutual aid is the typical honor. People don't usually start by laying down, in front of the coal train, or like some other really bold action. People usually start their engagement with social movements in mutual aid, and mutual aid is kind of the bulk of it. And I'm reading this book right now for my gender, sexuality, and law class that I'm teaching this week. I happen to be teaching this wonderful book that I love teaching called At the Dark End of the Street. It's by Danielle McGuire. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is a book about how most people think the civil rights movement was primarily about things like desegregation, getting rid of Jim Crow. And what's written out of that history is that so much of what formed the civil rights movement was activism by Black women against sexual violence against Black women by white men, and against the framing of Black men for sexual violence as a way to like justify like lynching and criminalization of Black men. And so in the book, Danielle McGuire spends a couple chapters talking about the Montgomery bus boycott and how what really prompted the Montgomery bus boycott originally was that Black women were relentlessly harassed on buses in Montgomery, on segregated buses, and that the Black women overwhelmingly rode the bus because they were domestic workers and maids of different kinds, doing that kind of work. And so they were, in general, Black people rode the bus much more than white people, and Black women especially rode the bus a lot. And there was just case after case of them being sexually harassed, arrested on buses, and then raped by cops. Like, the history of the fight against sexual violence against Black women really centered the bus, and that it was those cases of those Black women who were called those names and experienced those kinds of touch and those kinds of assault that generated this. And that and the book is so beautiful. Her account of that, her story of who Rosa Parks actually was, which was that she was a longtime anti-rape activist in movements, defending the humanity of Black women. Not this little old lady who got tired one day and didn't want to move on the bus, which is this amazingly depoliticized story of her life that's told in the mainstream. But the other part of the story of the Montgomery bus boycott is that it's not about these couple speeches made by Martin Luther King or other men. It's about how Black women coordinated rides and walked to work together and defended each other from all the white harassers who would harass them while they were walking to work during the boycott for over a year. Like there was these brigades of Black women who would make all this food and then go all around town selling it in order to fund the carpools because they needed carpool people who were going longer distances than could be walked. Like the mutual aid work, the work of just providing each other's rides was actually the center of what that boycott strategy was, not those speeches made by men, and that the boycott was called for by women, but that men claimed leadership as soon as it really took off, whatever.
So I'll stop it there. I mean, what's interesting to think about, I think, in relation to the lecture, just about health and mutual aid, and which is, I guess, a lecture that is critical about contemporary health discourse from the perspective of anti-racism and post-colonialism and queer and feminist rights and class antagonism, is to think about the ways that gender performativity for Judith Butler is not a contest that we lose, so that the gender binary is upheld by a whole series of, say, religious institutions, colonial histories, ways of organizing property ownership so that only cisgender heterosexual men of a certain race and class could own property. And this is how the gender binary comes to be solidified as a set of norms that we enact and over time see to be natural and uh, desirable. But obviously, in this time, what Judith Butler and queer and transgender theorists have taught us or have asked us to consider are the ways that the gender binary can actually be extremely harmful. And it can be harmful because of very rigid gender roles. It can also obviously institute illegality. If one assumes that someone cannot do a certain job or cannot have a certain occupation or cannot make a certain amount of money because of their gender identity, then it is perhaps plausible that they will not make proper hiring decisions. They will not compete fairly in education or in work. And so the sense that the gender binary then is actually harmful and that we might be doing ourselves, we might be doing ourselves a favor and we might be actually participating in progressive politics if we challenge the gender binary, leads me to think again about health. Is health performative in nature? So what Spade discusses is the idea of charity and the ways that institutions of charity and social services have often made health something that uh, the middle class and the rich have and can bequeath to the poor in the form of, say, food banks or Salvation armies. And this idea then that health is something that wealthy people have is then, I think, performative in nature, in the same way that gender is performative in nature. So the question in this class, which is about racialization in society, is whether or not white, cisgender, middle class settlers, and specifically English and French settlers, have constructed health as something that they possess and that we are all in need of, and that we must turn to white Christian and Catholic settlers to receive. And this is obviously, this opens up a whole series of debates regarding Western medicine. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning of the beginning of the lecture, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak discusses the ways that epistemic violence made entire systems of knowledge and languages inaccessible, unavailable, and undesirable because of the imagined superiority of white Western knowledge systems. And this is also true of medicine and health, I believe. There are many ways that people think about health throughout the world that do not involve, say, Health Canada or systems of Western medicine. So I will discuss four key ideas: mutual aid and mutual care, social solidarity, organic solidarity in the global pandemic. I will talk about COVID-19 and multiculturalism, and then I will finish by discussing illness and disability and anti anti-fascism. So firstly, sorry, sometimes I stutter. You will know this if you have um, viewed other lectures that I have posted online or given in person. Thank you very much for viewing this lecture. So firstly, mutual aid and mutual care. So mutual aid projects and practices, as Spade discussed in the previous clips, are not about charity and this kind of bequeathing of one's sort of charitable acts or donations onto the poor. They are about mutual solidarity, and mutual solidarity often involves a critique of the overarching kind of structures and systems that are in place that threaten us all. So Black Lives Matter has been involved in mutual aid projects throughout North America. Amid national Black Lives Matter protests, the Minnesota City Council voted to disband its police force. And the Minnesota Freedom Fund received more than 30 million from over 900,000 donors in just a few weeks. While the mobilizations of mutual aid projects, nonprofits, and local and state governments indicate a willingness to restructure society to prioritize care and collective access, paradoxically, these highly visible forms of care amplify its absence for those who are experiencing multiple forms of marginalization even before the present pandemic, economic crisis, and protests against police brutality. So collective care is enacted through these mutual aid projects. And collective care, as authors discuss mutual aid projects, is not just about care of individuals. It is about radical political demands on the state, and on private institutions, including on the healthcare system. It is also about political demands for cases of employment discrimination and housing discrimination to be taken seriously. Indeed, the collective care currently being enacted through mutual aid, radical political demands, and everyday acts of service have been called for and organized by sick and disabled trans and queer people of color for decades. Sick and disabled trans queer people of color have ample experiential knowledge on how to care for themselves and others, knowledge that is more important than ever in the face of the ongoing pandemic. Yet many continue to lack large public platforms and networks of social support. As mutual aid efforts go mainstream, gaining recognition and resources, but also facing the inevitable threat of co optation, the needs, experiences, and expertise of sick and disabled trans queer people of color are likely to be invisibilized. These contradictions create highly ambivalent experiences for many sick and disabled trans queer people of color, and for those of us who were already involved in mutual aid work before solidarity became a trending hashtag. So, mutual aid works to build lasting alternatives to state sponsored systems of care by organizing grassroots networks of supports that are reciprocal, transparent, and guided by participants' resources, skills, and knowledge. So mutual aid is not just about, say, the health of the body in isolation from society. In the same way that Judith Butler discusses the ways that gender identity is performative in relation to a certain time and space, in relation to a certain time period, the ways that gender performativity, sorry, is enacted in, say, India is obviously very different than the ways that gender performativity is enacted in North America. And this obviously, the way that we kind of perform under signs of, say, woman or man, or girl or boy would change over time period. And this is also true of health. And so the ways that we think about health, I think, um, cannot be separated from these other questions that really are at the forefront of a lot of social justice movements and human rights cases, like housing justice and housing insecurity, homelessness, contractual labor, job insecurity, hate crimes, um, all of these kind of societal trends impacts the ways that we experience health. Obviously, technology and the rise of technologically driven lives will impact our health and also impact the ways that we can think about health. So housing, I think, is one of the most obvious ways that we can think about health, that when someone is precariously housed, the health of the body could be looked at by a doctor or even by someone involved in social services or a charitable organization in isolation from society. But if one was to consider how the person would have fared if their entire lifestyle, if their work schedule, if everything was the same in their life if they were given housing security. And I would argue that their health would perhaps be considerably different because of the ways that housing insecurity does significant damage to someone's health. So I'll play this clip about mutual aid projects.
With Amex Platinum, there's nothing like accelerating your next getaway with an annual travel credit.
A lot of us are overwhelmed, pissed, and scared. I don't want to wait till the next election. I don't want to just write my congressperson and hope that they'll do the right thing. I don't want to just post things to the vacuum of social media. I don't want to just make statements about things. I want to change how things are. There are a zillion things we can do, and people are coming up with new ones all the time. This video is going to focus on mutual aid projects, what they are, and why we should be developing them right now. Mutual aid projects are a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, not just through symbolic acts or putting pressure on their representatives in government, but by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. During recent flooding and storms, we saw mutual aid in action as people helped each other survive. Mutual aid isn't just for those big weather disasters, it is also for the daily, routine, life-threatening disasters of capitalism and white supremacy. People who are pissed about police and prisons are doing mutual aid work like creating prison letter writing projects, where people get connected to pen pals in prison to build relationships, help prepare for release, help prisoners have advocates on the outside, and help build a movement against policing in prisons that is informed and led by the people who know the very most about how the system actually works. Some people are creating jail support programs where people get together to make a schedule and agree to be outside their local jail on that schedule and greet anyone getting out and help them get what they need. Maybe a ride, clothes, a phone to call contacts, information about services or benefits. Some people are organizing community bail funds, revolving funds that can pay people's bail so that they are not locked up while they try to prepare for their defense. Money bail systems are one of the ways that poor people and people of color are given the worst chances in the criminal system. Court support projects are where people coordinate to accompany someone facing charges to their court dates, ideally by packing the court with supporters each time, so that no one has to go alone, and sometimes to influence lawyers, judges, and jury by showing their support for the criminalized person. Some people are coordinating ride systems to help families visit prisoners who are being held in facilities far from home. In Oakland, the Oakland Power Projects are about strengthening people's skills to respond to community emergencies in ways that minimize police contact. When you call 911 for a health emergency, the cops come too, and that often leads to violence. The Oakland Power Projects is about training the community to respond to health emergencies, including mental health crises, chronic health problems, and acute health emergencies, so that people don't have to call 911. People who are scared about the emboldenment of ICE and Border Patrol and increasing deportations are doing things like forming rapid response networks where people warn each other about immigration raids and help each other hide, and helping immigrants do safety planning in case they get detained so that someone is ready to take care of their kids and elders. Some rapid response projects are even working on training people to show up and physically stop ICE from taking someone away. Imagine if we built that kind of power to stop arrests through rapid mobilization of a lot of people to outnumber cops. No More Deaths, an organization in Arizona, works to save the lives of people crossing the border by putting food, water, and supplies in the harsh desert areas where people who are crossing often die from the conditions. There are so many mutual aid project possibilities because there are so many intense ways people aren't having their needs met in the brutal systems we live under. Like food projects like Food Not Bombs, projects where people organize temporary housing for people coming out of prison or foster care by opening their homes to each other, childcare collectives where people watch each other's kids so they can go to political meetings, court, or jobs, projects where people accompany vulnerable people like trans people or people with disabilities to medical appointments or public benefits offices and hearings, projects where people make sure neighbors being pushed out by gentrification have good access to information about their housing rights and accompany each other to housing court, help people read documents and defend themselves from eviction, projects where people protest landlords who are refusing to make repairs or give back security deposits by directly protesting at those landlords' houses and businesses. Messages of this work are: the government is, we can't rely on it. You are not alone. The system is the problem, not the person being targeted by it. And we're going to take matters into our own hands and help each other survive right now, rather than expecting help from the same systems that have a clear history of causing harm. Mutual aid projects don't just help with the current disasters, they help us prepare for the ongoing disasters that are emerging because of climate chaos and crumbling infrastructure. When we build cooperative projects, practice making decisions together, share things, meet more people in our communities, and learn about each other's skills and needs, and learn how current systems work and how they are not working, we're better prepared for the next storm, the next blackout, and the next budget cuts. Something really important about all this is that mutual aid is not charity. Charity is where rich people and institutions give tiny crumbs to poor people to make themselves look better. Usually there are a lot of strings attached to what they give, like giving only to mothers or only to children, only to sober people or only to people of faith. Charity rides on the idea that rich people or social workers should decide who is a deserving poor and who is the undeserving poor, and that rich people can put conditions on the housing or food or cash they give poor people. Charity blames poor people for poverty. Mutual aid blames the system for making people poor and says everyone deserves everything they need. Charity affirms the existing distribution of wealth and life chances. Mutual aid challenges it. Charity is top down, mutual aid is horizontal. Charity is about control, hierarchy, and isolation. Mutual aid is about solidarity, liberation, and participation. People are scared and angry right now and trying to find ways to fight back and support each other. Building mutual aid projects is a way to plug people in, build shared understandings of current conditions, offer meaningful support to vulnerable people, and prepare for the coming disasters. Mutual aid work is not easy. It means forming lasting commitments to doing hard work, collaborating with people even when we have conflict, and facing the heart-wrenching realities of the systems we live under. It is also deeply satisfying work that transforms us from being exasperated, passive observers of the shitstorm we're living in to inspired builders of the new world we desperately crave and need. Stop believing in authority and start believing in each other. We're all we've got. We're all we need.
So, trans queer people of color have historically relied on one another for kinship, care, and resources. Yet, when it comes to care, our communities are marked by tensions between abundance and absence. Long before COVID-19, many trans, queer, and people of color were redistributing wealth, sharing meals, offering rides, and opening up our homes while struggling to gain the support we need in the face of rampant racialized, gendered violence, and structural inequalities. So, the sense of activism is really about mutual care and community building rather than thinking about health as viewing a body as an object of, say, medical inquiry, or seeing a body as a cadaver to be experimented on, um, or seeing a body as someone who you could place in a hierarchy. So colonialism was very much about the counting of things, the counting of different types of flora and fauna by European colonizers, the counting of different peoples who were named in certain ways as people who belonged to different tribes and different classes and different nations. It was also about the counting of other people's money in gold and in English, and French and European languages. And so the countenance of the human body is perhaps a facet of colonial rule, and the kind of measuring of the body is a specific way of thinking about the human body and life. And when we only think about the human body and life, I guess, in one way, or we refuse to take seriously, or we refuse to take any other way of thinking about the body and life seriously, we are perhaps committing acts of epistemic violence against other systems of knowledge. And epistemic violence is not just an act of mindless violence or purpose or meaningless violence. It is purposeful in the sense that it institutes European systems of knowledge and Europeans as being more intelligent than others and as capable of rational decision making and as capable of being in positions of authority as a doctor, a police officer, a landlord, an owner, someone who is a politician, a priest, someone who is capable of telling others what to do with our bodies and our lives. Under the guise of this kind of authoritarianism, many fascist regimes have used the language of health and criminality to steal other people's money and their homes, and to do damage to fair economic competition. The Nazis, of course, were some of the most extreme and historically documented groups of people who used medicine and health to try to ethnically cleanse religious minorities, particularly Jewish people from Europe and from the world. Nazis also tried to use ideas of health and illness to criminalize and kill queer people, people with disabilities, women who did not marry in certain ways. I would argue, this kind of Nazi ideology obviously had religious undertones and was part of racist nation building, but the use of fascism often masks the desire to steal other people's wealth and to steal other people's property, their land, their things, their intellectual property, and to rob them of the capacity to work and to compete fairly and to live their own lives in peace. So, despite mutual aid being imagined as a more autonomous, dignified, and ethical form of care, that humanitarianism or development, than humanitarianism or development, it can also fall prey to the same dynamics of exceptionalism. Anthropologists of humanitarianism argue that people are most willing to offer aid in the wake of exceptional events such as epidemics, natural disasters, and war. So the exceptional is really not the typical. And the problem with constructing kind of exceptions to rules is that we still believe that the rules are the only system in place to count and to govern. And so if these rules of, say, counting of the body as being more or less like a European ideal is going to determine health or unhealth, or is going to determine who is unhealthy or healthy, then the exception is actually someone who is abjected because of epistemic violence. I mean, the kind of corporations that determine health or unhealth or those who are unhealthy or healthy are obviously funded by certain pharmaceutical companies, but they're also governed by a set of ideas and English language norms and capitalist ideas of health. Health is also inextricable from work. So the ways that one imagines, say, being in good health is also about a healthy person who works. So health is about really the workforce. So I am healthy enough to work productively throughout the business week. And I must kind of constantly replenish my health so I can keep working over and over and over again to support the economy. And this, again, obviously overlooks the ways that people throughout the whole course of human history have always thought that health might involve a refusal to do certain forms of labor. And mental health might also involve a refusal to do certain forms of labor. And so health, I think, is something that is not necessarily a rule, and being unhealthy is not an exception. In many ways, one could say that it would be exceptional for someone to have the capacity to be healthy without being interfered with or without being harmed by a whole series of institutions and forms of systemic discrimination, child abuse, domestic violence, fat shaming and body shaming, name calling, labor exploitation. So if we think of health as actually being an exception to a rule, then this changes how we approach health as a form of activism against all of the kind of norms that actually could prevent people from living their best lives. So COVID-19 was an interesting example of the ways that a pandemic and uh, could actually draw attention to all of the ways that health is actually quite exceptional, and that our everyday rule of law and our everyday lives could actually be routinely interrupted by the routine and, I guess, regular existence of pandemics and disease, which could proliferate more and more in our time period because of global climate change and because of um, the reality of, say, uh, poverty, the mobility and the mass number of people who are in circulation at all times who are trying to flee poverty and ethnic cleansing throughout the world. Um, all of these things will contribute to more and more crises in health. And they will also always lead to efforts to profit financially from health crises and to also even simulate health crises in ways that are profitable for corporations and for the ruling class. While COVID-19 has generalized the conditions under which anyone can get sick, lose their job, or struggle with accessing resources, disease spreads disease spreads continue to put certain precarious populations at increased risk of preventable illness and, preventable illness, disability, and death. It was clear from the onset that sick, immune compromised, and elderly people are at the highest risk of hospitalization or death if they contract the virus. As early as April 2020, studies began to confirm that Black and Latinx communities are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, contracting COVID-19 at higher rates than white Americans. The emergent forms of care that are being embraced by mutual aid projects, nonprofits, universities, and governing bodies were always already needed, but used to be dismissed as excessive, unrealistic, or not worth the investment. In other words, particularly forms of suffering had to become universal in order to become worthy and deserving of a collective social response. Yet, as these ideas become part of the collective common sense, they simultaneously marginalize many people who continue to lack consistent and reliable support. Highly visible displays of solidarity, such as Black Lives Matter, banners hung across businesses, billboards thanking essential workers for their service, or messages of unity in the face of COVID-19 fall flat for many sick and disabled, transgender, queer people of color. So this kind of branding of health is not the same as mutual aid and mutual care, which is what authors discuss. When university classes suddenly switched to online learning and departments redirected funds from canceled conferences and events to pay out stipends to struggling graduate students, my friends Chris Mendez, a non-binary queer Latinx PhD student, living with multiple sclerosis, was still wondering whether he will be forced to drop out of his program due to the university's year-long limit on medical leaves and lack of appropriate employment accommodations for people with chronic health conditions. In 2019, Chris's health rapidly deteriorated while he fought a 9-month battle with the University of California, San Diego over accommodations that would allow him to work remotely. So again, institutions are not really going to produce exceptional results. They are going to uphold rules. And when they uphold rules, it would be exceptional if people found ways to participate in these institutions while also trying to support their own longevity. Similarly, my friend Liz, a chronically sick and disabled queer cisgender white woman, posting on her Facebook page on April 2020, wrote, "This is a very trying time for us and many minority groups. We are very grateful that some people are taking quarantine seriously to keep us alive. And yet, people are virtually opening up spaces like museums and dances and the things of life we were told were not possible for us to be included in. Suddenly, family members and friends check in when they did not respond to us in the past. Resources are being redirected now that able-bodied people who can benefit from capitalism are now being affected." So I will post the reference online for the articles that I cite in the lecture, and I'll post them on uh, the university online system, and I will also post them on YouTube as well. So quarantine has forced able people to experience the mundane forms of suffering that many sick and disabled people deal with on a daily basis in an ableist society that isolates, prevents access, and defines social value based on a person's ability to work. While grief and mourning are valid responses to the loss of everyday practices that that many able-bodied people enjoy before quarantine, this experience has not been equally transformative for everyone. I'll stop the screen share for a minute. I want to give you the proper reference. When I post the slides online, I will give you reference in the actual article PDF. So the article I'm citing in this lecture is called Mutual Aid and Its Ambivalences, Lessons from Sick and Disabled Trans and Queer People of Color. And it was written by Alexia Arani. And so I will give you this reference and a copy of the article in PDF. And I think it's a really interesting article and one that is really topical and touches on some of most interesting political and ethical questions of our time regarding health and humanitarianism, charitable acts and activism, and the health of the human body. So the author discusses disability justice and studies. Disability justice teaches that consistency is not achieved through saviorism. The patronizing colonial mindset that a single person or group of people can alleviate all suffering in the world through use of expert knowledge and resources. Rather, consistency requires that we know our limits, how we need to be replenished, and who we can call upon for help. These webs of self and collective care are the beating pulse of mutual aid, that which differentiates this work from humanitarianism and charity, and what will ensure our collective survival in the face of endless threats against the lives and livelihoods of sick and disabled trans, queer, person of color communities. So mutual aid is a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. Unlike charity and state-based social services, which frequently blame social problems on individuals, moral failings, mutual aid recognizes that capitalist white supremacist institutions are responsible for producing poverty, inequality, and violence. So those who write about mutual aid also discuss homelessness and the ways that homelessness is impacted upon health. And mutual aid activists often look at the ways that homeless populations, or sorry, those who write about mutual aid often look at the ways that homeless populations or those who might be made homeless support each other. So I will discuss social solidarity, organic solidarity in the global pandemic. And I will record this lecture in two parts. So the global pandemic offered examples in which we can think about the ways that health is inextricable from systemic discrimination, from institutions of power, and from violence. Domestic violence is something that researchers have discussed in great detail, and there are many articles about the ways that the pandemic impacted those who are survivors of domestic violence. During adversities, vulnerable groups experience inequalities, both as cause and consequence. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the impact on women due to the already existing gender inequalities. The warning of the shadow pandemic of domestic violence that the UN gave in the early pandemic phase is turning evident. As women are locked inside the house with their abusers, they are unable to seek help and social support. There has been an increase in domestic violence and intimate partner violence worldwide during the lockdown period in comparison to the pre-lockdown time. Ravindran and Shaw researched reveals that domestic violence and cybercrime increased in the red zone areas that were under strict lockdown. Along with fighting a pandemic like COVID-19, society needs to fight against the syndromes of social distance, exclusion, and individualism. For this, collective consciousness should be developed to overcome this crisis. For decades since its implementation, Canadian multiculturalism has arrived at a crossroad where multiculturalism's idea of inclusion, equality, and social justice could be obstructed by discourses of the retreat and failure of multiculturalism, leading to its complete abandonment. Particularly, increased instances of anti-racism during the current COVID-19 pandemic in Canada are reminiscent of racist racist incidents and ethnic tensions in history that gave rise to doubts about the usefulness and effectiveness of multiculturalism. So during the global pandemic, there were instances in which domestic violence became extremely high in communities that are often thought to be cultural communities or ethnic communities that have been given legal rights to almost self-govern or practice their religion and culture in isolation from Canadian society, and with protection from Canadian law. So from an intersectional feminist and queer perspective, the law protects people who would like to practice their religion or their culture in the privacy of their home and within an enclosed sort of ethnic or religious community. The law protects women and queer people and children from domestic violence. So there are obviously these ongoing tensions, and in the history of Canada, many have consistently debated the usefulness of multiculturalism. Class is obviously informed by multiculturalism. So if someone creates an enclosed ethnic or religious group where people constantly defend the idea of the family and the religious family, then what about the social mobility or class mobility of women and girls or queer people or anyone, children, young people, people who do not want to be, say, part of an ethnic or religious community that might be threatened by their class mobility, intelligence, and critique. So Emile Durkheim is a sociologist who discusses the concept of social solidarity. And for Durkheim, there's an intellectual quest to find what really holds people together in a society. And so while there are these efforts constantly to engage in nation building, the building of cities, to sell houses and food and products to people, Emile Durkheim has an intellectual quest to find out what would really hold people together in social bonds that they would actually see as meaningful without any irony or without any fear. What would it actually take for people to see themselves in solidarity with each other? Durkheim developed the dichotomy between mechanical and organic solidarity to decipher the shift in social bonds that glued people and societies together. Mechanical solidarity is present in traditional societies where there is likeness between individuals, and organic solidarity is seen in modern societies, having people with differences and following different pursuits. So, if mechanical solidarity is present in traditional societies where there is likeness between individuals, then organic solidarity is seen in modern societies having people with differences and following different pursuits. So, if we see, say, mechanical solidarity as being solidarity of an ethnic community, so my parents are from India and I have a Hindu name, and so mechanical solidarity would be the solidarity that would be present in, say, a traditional agrarian rural village society, where religion would kind of hold us together. However, organic solidarity would only develop if people acknowledge that we are different in a capitalist society and we have very different pursuits. So there are women with names like mine who might want to pursue an MBA, or they might want to be queer and change their name or have the same name as a queer person of color, or they might want to be an actor or a model. I mean, we cannot have social solidarity, and there will be no organic solidarity um, if we do not recognize in modern societies that people have differences and will follow different pursuits. If we expect that there will be mechanical solidarity in the form of traditional societies, we cannot really participate in modern capitalism. And this is what Emile Durkheim discusses. Collective consciousness governs mechanical solidarity in traditional societies, where organic solidarity is the offshoot of the division of labor and interdependence in modern society. So collective consciousness is really about communalism, that we all collectively understand that, say, if someone is a Hindu or a Hindu girl or a Hindu woman, they will be part of a certain traditional society and they will participate in these traditional religious norms and familial norms and marriage structures. Organic solidarity is the offshoot of a division of labor and interdependence in modern society. So we must respect someone's right to work and sell their labor. The fundamental question that how there is a transformation of social solidarity and how its state and degree can be determined is described by Durkheim in his book, The Division of Labor in Society, and this was published in 1893. So there must be common values and norms for us to have social solidarity and for us to not engage in antagonism that could lead even to warring. Emile Durkheim asserted that solidarity increases during the course of social evolution while moving from mechanical to organic solidarity. In his view, organic solidarity is stronger than mechanical solidarity in modern societies. The importance of mechanical solidarity gets reduced as we move from simple to complex society, but that does not get eliminated as a unifying element, even though organic solidarity paves its way in modern society. Although he initially ignored the persistence of mechanical solidarity in the modern world, his later work covertly reflected it more prominently than organic solidarity. According to Parsons, Durkheim, towards the end of life, regarded common values and norms as the basis of solidarity in all groups and societies. Therefore, it is not the organic, but the mechanical solidarity that unfolds itself and flourishes in the modern world. So there is still this need in Durkheim's work to think about this, traditional forms of solidarity, which could be just about this, health and care for the human body. It could also be just about really basic ways of thinking about humanity. However, one could critique Durkheim and think about the ways that this kind of common sense and these common values do not necessarily make sense in our contemporary society because of gender norms and gender roles that our laws and our labor force no longer supports. So Emile Durkheim rejected the notion that collective morality will necessarily wane in modern society. To him, common consciousness or collective consciousness, which Durkheim uses interchangeably, cannot be absent even in the most advanced society. Durkheim's cult of man is his only expression of mechanical solidarity found in modern society. It denotes the idea that traces of common consciousness in modern societies are based on the concurrence of minds. So this kind of collective morality is about common consciousness, and the concurrence of minds could just be about respect for the human mind and body. However, I would still argue that this kind of traditional or mechanical solidarity, when it is gendered in nature, will never really lead to a common consciousness because it will always lead one to think that the gendering and the forced gendering of the body, which could include child abuse, rape, pedophilia, forced marriage, and the complete career destruction of women and queer and transgender persons' careers is somehow common knowledge or common sense because it will uphold this kind of gendered division of household labor for some gendered bodies and high paid professional labor for others. So I will actually just record the lecture in one instance instead of having two videos. And I hope the recording does record. Sometimes there are technical difficulties with online academic labor. So COVID-19 and multiculturalism has been discussed at length by sociologists. Anti-Black racism in Canada during COVID-19 was initially triggered by the death of a 29-year-old Black Toronto resident, Regis Korchinski-Paquette. On May 27, 2020, Regis fell 24 stories from a balcony of the apartment where her family lived. At the time of the incident, Regis was with the police alone in the apartment, and the police refused to reveal what happened right before her death. Regis's family raised concerns that Regis's death may be related to racism against Black people. Therefore, news reports on this case immediately ignited anger from the police, and protests against anti-Black racism and police brutality soon followed. The protests were joined by those in solidarity with lives lost to racism in the US at that time, with the most appalling case being the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. This case became the breaking point of the most current wave of civil rights movement in the US, referred to as Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement in the US, together with the Regis case in Canada, have brought to the spotlight the issue of police brutality against the Black in Canada. As CBC News research on fatalities at the hands of the police shows, Black and Indigenous people are overrepresented in death caused by police violence. So, Canadian multiculturalism has always been aggressively debated by those who think about racism, labor, discriminatory hiring, and police practices, as opposed to a celebratory rhetoric about food and ethnic separatism. Multiculturalism has always been aggressively debated in Canada by those who consider the ways that the rights of children, women, trans, and queer people are universal rights as opposed to the rights of men to abuse children, rape, and stalk women under the guise of some sort of ethno-fascist community building. So COVID-19 gave us a great deal of data and statistics and instances when we could consider the limits of multiculturalism in dealing with xenophobia. The illusions between certain groups of people as being harbingers of plague and disease was with us throughout the pandemic. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, there has been a surge in xenophobia and racism across Canada towards Asian Canadians, particularly those of Chinese descent. They have been spat on, verbally abused, and physically attacked. Many became the scapegoat who were wrongly blamed for spreading the virus just because it was first reported in China. They shouted to go home, although some of them are born in Canada who have never visited their ancestral lands. Many of them have also become the target of hate crimes. Since the outbreak of the global pandemic, there has been a significant rise in reported hate crimes perpetuated against Asian Canadians. In Vancouver, for example, hate crime incidents, targeting Asian communities rose by 717% in 2020 compared to 2019, the highest per Asian capita in North America. Some of its members are stigmatized because of the virus, and their properties are vandalized. So housing is, again, really interesting to think about, that vandalism of people's housing, and particularly in certain neighborhoods like Chinatowns, was common during the global pandemic. Finally, I'll finish by discussing illness, disability, and anti-fascism. Disability, illness, and anti-fascism. As academic corollaries of minority civil rights movements, queer theory and disability studies both have origins in and ongoing commitments to activism. Their primary constituencies, sexual minorities and people with disabilities, share a history of injustice. Both have been pathologized by medicine, demonized by religion, discriminated against in housing, employment, and education, stereotyped in representation, victimized by hate groups, and isolated socially, often in their families of origin. Both constituencies are diverse in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, political affiliation, and other respects, and therefore share many members as well as allies. So the disability studies movement and scholarship regarding disability studies is quite varied in nature. And in my work, which I've recently published about gender and sexuality, feminism, and urbanism in urban India, I have cited the work of scholars and activists who write about caste and disability and casteism and ableism. And so there are different historical trajectories that authors within disability studies and who are part of the disability justice or rights movements would draw on. Eugenics and Nazism is obviously an archive that one makes reference to when thinking about the criminalization of the ill and the disabled in Europe and in white European and white Western countries. So eugenics was a movement of racial hygiene, which I've discussed in previous lectures. And the idea of who was fit or defective justified Nazism, the Holocaust, and genocide. And it did lead to war. So I'll finish the lecture by citing James Baldwin, who states, "A victim who can articulate their status as a victim ceases to be a victim and becomes a threat." So that is an additional lecture for the class, which I hope you are enjoying thus far. And I will post the article that I've cited from and the articles that I've cited from online, as well as the references. And this is my latest book, and it is called Concrete Women, Gender, Urbanism, and Protest in South Asia. And I do discuss social movements, including movements regarding health and healthcare, mutual aid and mutual care movements in India and urban India, by the transgender, queer, and feminist movement in India. And I also discuss colonialism, health, and disability studies and rights in India. So thank you very much. Happy Pride. Thanks. Bye.